Alright guys, here we have the topic CSS Grid. CSS Grid layout is the most powerful layout system available in CSS. It is a two-dimensional system, that means it can handle both columns and rows, unlike Flexbox, which is largely a one-dimensional system. Okay, this is the grid in terms of CSS. Actually, the grid is made up of rows and columns, where we can create columns and rows just like tables. Using that concept, in CSS also, we can make any element behave like a grid, where we can divide the element into rows and columns. So how we can do that actually? Let's understand the fundamentals of CSS grid here. So here we have taken one index.html file, and this time I'm using SAS. So this is the style.css, which is already watching. If I stop this, so now it is not watching. Yeah, and then here we have general.scss, few normal styles that you can know. Then here I have taken one grid.scss file where we will be writing all the grid properties and values inside this file. And apart from these, we have few more files, that is general, that you have already seen, reset, you know what is the use of reset, and this is our vars, that is the variables. Okay, cool. Now let's see our page, how actually it looks like. Give it a refresh. Yeah, this is we have. Okay, now style.css, the grid is already imported inside this file. Okay, let's watch the style.css file. Perfect. Now the very first thing inside the HTML file, let's take few elements to which we can make behave like a grid. Okay, so let's take one container. Okay, and inside the container, let's take few items. So item. Okay, let's take just 6 item. So here we have 6 item to which we have applied the class of item. Perfect. Now let's have a look of our page here. Okay, here we have those items. Actually, I've already styled the items inside the grid. You can see here, to which we have applied padding, background color, border, text line center, font weight, font size, these all things. So that's why we are seeing here that each and every item is having some default style that is coming from the grid.scss from this item. Perfect. Now let's understand how grid system works. That's the fundamental of grid. So very first thing, to any element you want to make behave like a grid, so you will have to define a property, that is display grid. You already know we have different display properties to which we can apply display flex, display block, display line block. Similarly, we can also make display grid to any element. So let's target this container. Let's say container display grid. Okay, before we check out our page, the very first thing I would like to mention here, most of the things you may find for the grid that it is resembled with the flexbox. There are a lot of things you will find. A few properties inside the flexbox as well as inside the grid are similar, but they are different also. Okay, let's have a look of our page now. To the container here we have applied display grid, nothing else. Okay, let's give it a refresh here. Perfect. So here we have applied display grid, but you won't find any changes, because in flexbox model you might have find that whenever we used to apply display flex, automatically these items comes into a single line. Yeah, but in grid it is not like that. Actually the flexbox was one dimensional, so each and every item used to come in a single line, but inside the grid you will have to define specifically or explicitly how much number of columns you need inside the grid, how much number of rows you need inside that particular grid. So for that purpose we will have to define few columns, few rows inside the grid. So that's why we didn't see any changes whenever we apply display grid. So let's say we need 3 columns. So to define column we have a properties, that is grid template columns. So this grid template columns will generate columns for us inside the grid. So whatever the number of columns and whatever the size of those columns you want, you can define here. Say for example we need 3 columns and each column would be of 100 pixel or 200 pixel. So let's define 200 pixel first column, 200 pixel second column, 200 pixel third column. So now we will be having 3 columns inside this container. Yeah, so let's have a look. Okay, here we have first column, second column and third column. That's what we have defined here. And one more thing here, if you want to create any columns or rows inside a grid, first of all you will have to make that element into a grid, that is display grid. This property is important. Okay, now say if you want to define the rows also, here we haven't defined any rows but still we see those rows. We will get into those things in more detail, that we will see how these rows are generated and what are the things we can do with the columns and rows inside the CSS grid, but later on. So now let's create rows also. Rows will provide some height to those columns. Similarly to the way we have defined grid template columns, we can also define grid template rows. So here also you want to define, say you want to two rows, so you can say maybe 100 pixel 100 pixel. So this property will generate 2 rows for us that will be having height of 100 pixel and 100 pixel. So we have 2 values, so 2 rows will be created. Save this, give it a refresh. Okay, you can see we have 2 rows, yeah, and each row is having height of 100 pixel. Yeah, that's what we have defined. That's the fundamental of CSS grid. This is how it actually works. Whenever you need some columns and rows inside any element or inside any page, you can make use of this property, that display grid template columns, number of columns it will generate, grid template rows, it will generate number of rows. So whatever the number of rows and columns you want, you can use these properties. Yeah, okay, we will get into more detail about all of these things, what is actually happening here. But before that, let's understand some of the important terminology inside the CSS grid that we must keep in our mind to make use of the properties and values inside the CSS grid. So very first terminology is grid container and grid item. Similar to the flex box, as we have already discussed, whenever we need to make any element flex box, so we used to apply display flex, and automatically that element becomes flex container, and the item inside that it becomes flex item. Similarly here also we have a grid container. So to which element we have applied display grid, that will automatically become a grid container, but the item inside that grid container will automatically become the children or grid item. So here that's the black border, you can see that's the grid container. Inside that we have few items, so those are the grid item. That's the first terminology inside the grid concept. So you can say here this container is a grid container and these items are grid items. Yep. Okay, cool. Now okay, let's define one border for our container. Let's say border of 6 pixel solid black. Yeah, save this, give it a refresh. Yeah, that's our grid container, and these yellow boxes are our grid items. After that, let's see what we have. That is grid line, the dividing line that makes up the structure of the grid. They can be either vertical column grid lines or the horizontal row grid lines, and reside on either side of the row or columns. That is here. So this is our grid lines. The grid lines, these lines are arbitrary. You may not find inside our page here. You can see here we have applied the border. That's why we can see we are seeing this line. But if you remove the border from our item, you will not find those lines. So those are the arbitrary lines which helps us to recognize where our items or the rows or columns are ending. So that's why for our convenience, let's apply the border, get back. Yeah, so these are the grid lines from here, here, here. Alright, so after the grid line, let's see what do we have. Grid track. The space between two adjacent grid lines are known as grid track. So here we can see this is the grid line, this is the grid line, and again this is the grid line. Yeah, so the space between these two grid lines are known as track. This is also our track, this is also our track. So in our page, a track, grid track. After that, we have grid area. The total space surrounded by four grid lines. A grid area may be composed of any number of grid cells. That means it can have any number of cells. So these are the individual cells actually. We'll see. After that we have grid cells. So we were talking about the grid area. So the total area surrounded by four grid lines. First, second, third, fourth. You can say these are the grid area. Similarly, first, second, third, and fourth. Again, these are the grid area. So the concept, the main thing is that all the area must be surrounded by four grid lines. After that, we have grid cell. The space between two adjacent row and two adjacent column grid lines are known as grid cell. It is a single unit of the grid, as you can see. That's the grid cell. So here we can say individual cells. First, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So these are the individual cells. Okay guys, so these are the few important terminologies that you must keep in mind. Although these all these terminologies might not make sense for you, but later on these all things will help you when you will be working with the different properties and values of CSS Grid.